explained one Puritan gentleman bluntly to the Archbishop of Canterbury when the latter rebuked Puritans for their disruptions. Christ said that he came not into the world to send peace, but the sword. Wheresoever Christ cometh, reiterated the famed Puritan preacher Richard Sibbes, he breedeth division. The conflict Sibbes was speaking of here, however, was not outward and social. It took place on the other great field of struggle against sin for Puritans, their own souls. The true path of the soul's salvation had just been mapped out by John Calvin and other continental Protestants, liberating those who followed it from the Catholic Church's deceitful byways that led only to hell. Puritans knew that following this arduous Calvinist path meant a long, stormy contest with sin, Satan, and doubt before they could feel assurance that they were among the precious few whom God had predestined for salvation. John Bunyan, in the midst of that contest, feared that the church towers of Bedfordshire were collapsing on him, and heard a voice from heaven warning him of his sins. Devils with flaming eyes like saucers snatched at the despairing future minister, John Rogers, to drag him to hell. The famously severe minister, William Perkins, ominously cried out, "Mercy!" repeatedly on his deathbed. Victory in this soul conflict, although far from guaranteed, could be triumphant. Massachusetts' future governor, John Winthrop, shed tears of joy as he was flooded with heavenly reassurance that he would spend eternity with Christ in heaven, while the poet Anne Bradstreet wrote of blissfully being called away by Christ, the bridegroom, in her meditations. An admirer reported that the English housewife, Bridget Cook, was often so filled with the joy of the Spirit that she would cry out, "Oh, my joy! Oh, my joy!" The central institution for guidance in these great Puritan struggles with outward and inward sin was, or should have been, the Church of England. Each Sunday, all the English were required to gather in its 9,000 parish churches for worship, the sacraments, and sermons. Sometimes they would assemble there for services of prayer and fasting after God inflicted plague, famine, and other disasters on England in response to the country's sins, or for services of thanksgiving after divine aid. Sometimes they might find a sinner before them, being disciplined, standing in a white sheet, and asking forgiveness for adultery, drunkenness, or a host of other moral offenses after being convicted in a church court. Puritans supported the Church of England's religious tasks as well as its religious monopoly. God had only one truth, and England should have only one monarch and one church that governed the country together in their different spheres. The Reformation had been about religious liberty only insofar that it meant the liberty to follow God's law correctly as outlined in the Bible. For Puritans, the problem with the Church of England was that it was following God's law only erratically, which meant, in their eyes, that it did none of its tasks well. It lagged far behind the continental Reformed churches in purging itself of the government, worship, and the inadequate discipline of its Catholic past. Ever-growing hostility toward Puritanism from authorities in church and state eventually pushed some Puritans to take the drastic step of immigrating to New England. The self-governing colonies Puritans created in New England were largely free of Puritanism's enemies and the other obstacles that had defined and hindered Puritanism in England. There was no significant mass of ungodly people to ridicule and resent them, and to thwart their efforts to repress sin. There were no lordly Church of England bishops to rule over their churches like autocrats and block their reforms, and the kings and queens who saw Puritans as a